The next topic I'm going to share about in this upload is with regard to communication. There are two types of communication. There's informal and formal, and there's direct and indirect as sub-factors of not direct or indirect, but formal and informal communication. So with those that we are obviously comfortable with, that are in our personal sphere, that are in our circle of friends, that are in our daily life at home or in any social context, informal is probably most apt. The relations of formal communication are a little bit different in handling and require different skills and different levels of formality and basic courtesy, really. So any informal relations are very manageable, very comfortable. They should feel comfortable. Any informal communication should always feel comfortable. When preparing oneself for formal communication, there's a lot more required, and there's a higher expectation from the receiver with regard to the impact and style and tactics of the person that they are either interviewing or speaking formally with in any business context or in any formal context, basically. So the formal communication, as I've mentioned, is a little bit more complex, and there's a lot more expected. Any interview skills, any preparation for interviews, always equip a person for a standardized formal communication process. The important aspects of communication, as we know, are the abilities to listen and learn, to assess a circumstance, assess a situation, and basically to be cautious with our choice of words, to be careful of how we describe how we mean to make a comment, and basically to be as clear and succinct as possible. It's not always easy to portray or convey formally in a fluid manner. Communication skills are quite difficult for some people, especially when there might be a point in any communication process that are challenging a person that is perhaps new to a circumstance or situation that they haven't been prepared for. So the simple piece of advice is always to pause. It's like reading a text, you always count after a comma and a full stop, and you don't always have to reply or respond, and you don't always have to have an answer. Sometimes not saying anything says a lot more. Sometimes it's more courteous not to say anything at all. So it's instinct and it's practice, and the rules of engagement with regards to communication vary. When in a formal context, it's very important to be able to stand back and objectively receive the messages or the queries or questions from the person that you're communicating with. Courtesy is always the main priority in any communication. Joviality isn't so much. Any informality in a formal process isn't usually welcome, and informal processes and formal processes of communication are very, very different. So it takes a lot of work for some people, a lot less for others, but there are many communication styles. As I've mentioned, there's the direct and indirect communication. So direct communication would be one-to-one upfront communication, and indirect communication might be in the form of correspondence, or it might be in the form of broadcasting, or just any other manner of such communication. So, the other matter that I want to mention with regard to communication skills is pretty much with regard to. I'm after getting distracted. There's noise disturbance. So, anyway, the communication process also requires not just courtesy, but also consideration and contemplation. Quick thinking is always helpful when in a communication process, and being able to quickly consider is sometimes a requirement, and sometimes not. Sometimes, as I've just mentioned, to pause and think and maybe not say anything at all fits or suits the process, and sometimes you might be expected to have a quick retort or a quick reply to what you're presented with. So it's all variable, it's all very different, and it's really an ability of assessing a situation to be able to know what is appropriate and what is correct, and what is fitting. So the matter with regard to the rules of engagement with courtesy, it's all very straightforward. Gestures are not always favourable. Some people can be very flamboyant with their gestures, and full of expression and oozing with personality, and sometimes that's just not favourable. Sometimes in formal processes, people don't even like a smile or a twitch or a reaction. So that would particularly be the case in interviews or in any formal setting. So informal is obviously different, as I've mentioned, wherever you feel comfortable with any one in your social circle or your family circle, basically require very little effort, little effort to, you know, be as cautious with your expressions and your gestures when you're comfortable in a communication process that's informal, and you're just pretty much safe in that zone. And when you're safe in a zone to communicate as you normally would about matters that are of confidentiality, the confidence of knowing that it's a safe zone is very important, but with obviously the consideration for what is safe to share and what isn't safe to share. So that's discernment. So that's another thing that one has to be able to practice, is discernment, when it is safe and when it isn't safe to share what you need to. So with formal, there isn't any such matter of any personal matters ever relayed or discussed. And as I mentioned, gestures are not helpful in formal either. So the basic tips are there. Knowing to discern when you're in a formal engagement or an informal engagement, and to present yourself as your best self, basically, is the most important thing. There's the issue then of self-image, how you choose to present yourself and how you choose to be seen. How do you choose to represent yourself? How do you choose to have a positive message relayed about your appearance, or your disposition or your deportment, any such factors like that? How do you represent yourself to the world, and how do you communicate your message? So at the moment, I'm communicating myself formally and informally. I'm in an informal context and discussing a formal matter. So this is just the rules of engagement for me at the moment, with human rights violations and etc etc etc. So we can only work with the tools that we have, and we can only make the best of a bad situation with what we have. And the main advice I would offer to anyone developing their communication skills is not only just the issue of formal and informal, but also with regard to the different etiquette throughout the world. Americans communicate differently informally and formally, and in Asiatic and Oriental countries, they have different expectations. So it's good to do your homework with regard to different nationalities and their communication skills and styles. Europeans are pretty much as we here in the democracy would communicate, and there's just so much homework that can be done on communication processes. And as I've mentioned in my previous upload, when there are individuals not respecting your communication process, you just you don't have to react, you don't have to respond, and you don't have to engage. Sometimes, as I've said, you either have a choice of a quick retort, or else you have sometimes a pause and think moment. So sometimes no response is better than any response at all. So that's the upload I'm going to share for now about communication. There's a lot of work in it, and putting your best self forward sometimes is always a good piece of advice. So how you choose to represent yourself and how you choose to correspond and communicate are really important life skills and very useful in many respects.